As we'll see, there are a number of different types of differential schedules of reinforcement. One of them that we use very often is called a DRA, or differential reinforcement of alternative behavior. Here we're reinforcing a specific alternative behavior. Usually this is something that will lead to the same outcome or same function as the challenging behavior. Many of you in your observations have identified a behavior as an alternative. It might be teaching a student to ask for help in the presence of a difficult situation rather than cursing and throwing materials onto the floor. In this case, you're teaching a behavior that isn't necessarily incompatible with the problem behavior. In other words, it's possible to do them both at the same time. And a child could curse and throw stuff off the desk and ask for help at the same time. A child could say hello and punch a kid at the same time. Those could both be ways of getting attention. But more than likely, if the alternative behavior meets the same need or serves the same function as the problem behavior and it works better, over time it's going to replace this problem behavior more and more. It's important when you're reinforcing an alternative behavior, at the same time you're minimizing the reinforcement the student receives for the challenging behavior. If you don't do that, it's probably not likely your intervention is going to be effective. The student may increase the alternative behavior some, but because he or she has been doing this challenging behavior for some time and it has a history of reinforcement, it will most likely continue to occur. When I see people in schools trying to implement DRA plans and they tell me they're not effective, the first thing I look at is whether or not the problem behavior is continuing to be reinforced. That is usually the problem. It's also important to point out sometimes the reinforcers we're talking about are not positive reinforcers. If, for instance, you have been working with a kid who engages in a behavior in order to escape or avoid a demand, that challenging behavior is maintained by negative reinforcement or the removal of the demand. Sometimes the alternative behavior that we want to teach is also going to be maintained by negative reinforcement. In other words, teaching the student to ask for a break. Technically, this is differential negative reinforcement of an alternative behavior, or DNRA. Or if we're teaching a behavior that's physically incompatible with the challenging behavior, that is technically differential negative reinforcement of incompatible behavior, or DNRI. I will tell you that if you use these terms in school settings, nobody is going to know what the heck you're talking about. So when we're talking in class, we can talk about differential negative reinforcement. I would suggest that in a school, just say differential reinforcement and then say to yourself, but I know this is negative reinforcement, and they don't. I want to talk a little about the differentiation between DRA, differential reinforcement of alternative behavior, and DRI, or differential reinforcement of incompatible behavior. Most of the time, what you're going to actually be doing is DRA, because it's usually more effective to teach the student an alternative behavior that leads to the same function or outcome as the challenging behavior. Sometimes, however, this is not practical or it's not the best option. The examples would be if the issue is a kid who is off task. So this is a kid that just looks around the room, stares off into space at times when he or she should be working. Sometimes a DRI is the simplest intervention here. DRI means that I'm picking a behavior that is physically incompatible with the problem behavior. So if I correctly define on task as, say, on task means that the student is attending to task materials, listening to or attending to the teacher, or following the teacher's directions. Off task means the student is staring at something other than materials, doing something other than what the teacher asked, or manipulating items that are not related to the task. If I define them like that, it's not possible for someone to be on task and off task at the same time. So if I reinforce the student for being on task, and I increasingly require the student to be on task more and more in order to earn a reinforcer, it will coincide that the student's going to be off task less and less. So sometimes I pick something that's physically incompatible, sometimes I pick something that pick a behavior that serves the same function. In either case, if I'm going to use these interventions, it needs to be something the student can already do. In other words, it has to be part of the student's repertoire of behaviors. If it isn't, then I need to teach it. So all of these schedules of reinforcement are for behaviors that the student can already do. You have to determine if the fact the student isn't doing it is a learning issue or performance issue. If it's a learning issue, then you teach the skill. If it's a performance issue, that means the student can do it and simply isn't. It's a motivation issue. You need to increase the student's motivation. The next guideline has to do with the amount of effort. The behavior that you're teaching needs to be of equal or less effort than the problem behavior. Go back to the efficiency analysis. That's why we do the efficiency analysis. We want to be sure that this behavior is not more difficult to do. If it is requiring a little more effort, then it has to produce greater reinforcement. The behavior has to be emitted at a rate that's going to provide sufficient opportunities for reinforcement. In other words, we want to be sure that not only the student can do this behavior, but the student is fluent enough in this behavior that he or she is able to do it enough to obtain enough reinforcement, or at least obtain reinforcement equal to what they were getting for the challenging behavior. And finally, we want to teach behaviors that are functional. What I mean by that is we want these behaviors to be things that will generate reinforcers in the real world. That's why things like teaching communication skills and the other things we would choose under DRA are so important. When we're selecting reinforcers, we need to pick things that we can actually deliver contingently. In other words, what are things that we can control? For example, it's much harder to use peer attention as a reinforcer than it is to use teacher attention, because we can withhold teacher attention more easily if the student doesn't engage in the behavior we want to see. The best way to identify potential reinforcers is to look at your functional behavior assessment. If the student is engaging in some challenging behavior, she or he is doing it for a reason already. If we understand the reinforcer for that behavior, we have already identified something that is important for the student. Whether or not we accept the behavior, we have to accept that this is something that's motivating the student. So if a student is doing some challenging behavior because he or she is trying to get the attention of peers, we need to understand that peer attention is very important for the student. We need to teach the student better ways to meet that need. Also, when we're using DRA or DRI, we need to reinforce the appropriate behaviors immediately. Problem behaviors are often reinforced very quickly. We need to reinforce these appropriate behaviors very quickly in the beginning. With the passage of time, we can introduce delays and we can fade reinforcement schedules, but we have to establish these new behaviors first. At the same time, we're minimizing the amount of reinforcement for the problem behaviors, and we're always using these with other procedures like teaching and prompting appropriate behaviors. Sometimes you might mess up. It's not a big deal. What matters is that you get back on track. If you inadvertently reinforce a problem behavior, just note it and change your behavior accordingly. This next intervention is a little weird, DRO, or differential reinforcement of other behavior, because it's essentially reinforcing a student for not responding. What we do in this intervention is we reinforce the student for going a period of time and not engaging in a challenging behavior. The way that we determine the value of this schedule is we calculate something called the inter-response interval. This is the average period of time between instances of behavior. So in this example, we've got the kid engages in 5 problem behaviors in a 10-minute period. So to determine the rate of a behavior, we take the behavior and we divide it by the unit of time. So if we've got 5 behaviors happening in 10 minutes, that's a rate of 0.5 behaviors per minute. We usually express rate in terms of minute or hour, depending on how frequently the behavior occurs. If you calculate inter-response interval, we take that fraction or that ratio and flip it around. We take the amount of time divided by the number of behaviors. So if we've got 10 minutes, we have 5 behaviors. That comes out to be 1 behavior every 2 minutes. So the initial DRO schedule would be less than 2 minutes, because what we want to do is we want to reinforce the student before he or she engages in a challenging behavior. So we would start our actual intervention at 1 minute because we're going to drop down below 2 minutes. I mean, we could probably do 1.5 minutes, but for simplicity, always keep it at a whole minute if you can. With DRO's interventions, usually we start out with a fixed interval. So let's say that in our previous example, we're reinforcing the student every 1 minute that he doesn't get out of his seat, let's say. Or let's pick a different example. Let's say that the kid is yelling out something about about 10 times or 5 times in 10 minutes. So about every minute, we're going to reinforce this kid with verbal praise. In the beginning, we start out requiring the kid to go a whole minute. So for every whole minute this kid does not engage in that behavior, we give him some praise, like, I really like the way you're paying attention today. That's awesome. And then maybe a minute later we might get eye contact and give him a thumbs up. We can vary it. It's not going to be the same. And it can be very subtle as well. If we're using some kind of point system, we might be giving him points on the schedule as well. If the problem behavior occurs, though, we just reset that interval. So he's 30 seconds into it and he has an outburst, so you just reset it back to another minute. It's not that critical that it's exact. If it's about every minute, that actually works just as well. But initially, these need to be pretty frequent sometimes. As you might have guessed, with what you already know about schedules of reinforcement, you want to quickly move to some kind of variable interval. So with DRO, we start out the schedule based on where the student is in baseline, and then we start adding time to that. So we might go from a fixed interval 1 minute to a fixed interval 2 minutes to a fixed interval 3 minutes, maybe all the way up to fixed interval 5 minutes. At that point, I would switch from a fixed interval to a variable interval schedule. So variable interval, I'm going to go around some average of, let's say, 5 minutes. So it might be 3 minutes one time, and then it might be 4 minutes, then it might be 7 minutes, then it might be 5 minutes. So the student doesn't know exactly when the interval is going to end. Because of that, you get more steady performance. It adds an element of unpredictability to the delivery of reinforcement. The next step in fading a DRO program is to switch from something we were doing before, which was really whole interval DRO. In other words, we were requiring the student to go the entire interval without engaging in the behavior in order to be reinforced. Once the behavior has been reduced quite a bit, we can move to something called momentary DRO. In momentary DRO, you're reinforcing the student if the behavior is not occurring at that instant the interval ends. In other words, you don't really have to attend to the student the whole time, but if it's a variable interval 5 minutes or variable interval 6 minutes, it's on the average of every 6 minutes, the interval's up. The student is either engaging in the behavior or not. The student's not engaging in the behavior, he or she earns a reinforcer. You would never start an intervention this way, but it's very effective in maintaining low levels of a behavior once it's been reduced. The advantage of this intervention is it's much easier to implement, and it requires a lot less effort on the part of the person carrying it out. So I've used these in the past when it might be the interval, say, is 30 minutes long. And all I have to remember is just not to reinforce the student if the behavior isn't occurring at that particular moment in time. I wouldn't use this for a really serious, challenging behavior either, but things like just minor disruptions or low-level kinds of problems, it can work extremely well. Something you need to remember about DRO, it is not an instructional procedure. In other words, it does not teach appropriate behavior. If you're going to use it, always use it with something else. Always use it with a plan for teaching an alternative behavior. Overall, people use the interval strategy more than the momentary strategy, and the interval strategy actually works better. That's why you should always start out with that one. The momentary DRO can be useful if you've got a behavior reduced to very low levels and you want to keep it there. Because it's much easier to implement, it can be worked in as part of your fading program. Some problems that sometimes come up when you're using a DRO. If another behavior begins to occur. So in other words, in the beginning, you may have had one target behavior that you were trying to reduce. Let's say that the kid had verbal outbursts, but another one starts to emerge. You see the kid engaging in a second problem behavior. You may need to adapt your intervention to include that behavior as well. If you add a second behavior, it's probably good to shorten your interval and sort of go back in your program a little bit to ensure the student's going to be more successful. You can always increase it later, increase the interval, but anytime you make something more difficult in one regard, you want to make it easier in another. So if I'm making it more difficult by including another behavior, I'm going to shorten the interval to make it a little easier. I want to increase the likelihood it's going to be successful. If I've already used a longer interval initially, I can increase this interval pretty quickly the second time, and pretty soon I'll be back where I was before. If you go to momentary DRO and you're attempting to fade and you see an increase in the problem behavior, I would go back to using the whole interval DRO. Sometimes it would be necessary to shorten the interval again. I will tell you this usually does not happen, at least that's not been my experience. I think it would happen if you went to momentary DRO too early, and then you would just need to go back to whole interval for a longer period of time before trying it again. It would also be important to teach an alternative behavior because it's telling you that this student still has a need to access the reinforcer he or she gets through the challenging behavior. So if I'm going to implement a DRO program, first I need an effective reinforcer. I need something that's going to motivate the student. And then I need a way of communicating this to the student. How can I do it visually? How can I involve the student in the intervention plan? Then I need to set the DRO interval. In order to do that, I need some data of the student's behavior before the intervention. If you've done a functional behavior assessment, you have that data. I want to calculate the mean baseline inter-response interval, or inter-response time, and I want to set my initial DRO interval at that value or slightly less. I always made it a little less because I found that the likelihood the student was going to be successful initially it increased. Remember, with these intervention plans, initially the goal is not to change the behavior right away. The initial purpose is for the student to experience the reinforcer. A reinforcement program is only going to work if the student experiences some initial success. I can very quickly change the criteria of reinforcement once that's happened. At the same time, I want to be very careful that I have minimized the amount of reinforcement the student's going to get for the challenging behavior. Once the program started and the student's earning the reinforcer, I need to start gradually increasing this interval. There are different ways I can do that. I can increase it by some kind of duration. So I can, for instance, increase it by 3 minutes every 2 days the student has earned the reinforcer. Or I can increase it proportionally. In other words, in the beginning, I make smaller increases, and then as time passes, I make larger increases. And then the third option is based on the learner's performance or history. I actually use a combination of number 2 and 3. I increase the values proportionally. In the beginning, I'm very cautious because, especially if I don't know the student, I don't want to create ratio strain or schedule strain. That's when you increase a reinforcement schedule too quickly. Once the student has some learning history, though, with an intervention and is experiencing success, then I can make larger increases. As we said about other kinds of interventions, I like to start these in one setting and build the schedule value up to the point that it can be implemented more easily. Then I extend it into other situations, other settings, or other times of the day. Remember, DRO is not an instructional procedure. It doesn't teach alternative behaviors. So you're always going to use this with some other kind of intervention. More specifically, you're always going to teach some appropriate behavior along with implementing a DRO. The next differential reinforcement program is called differential reinforcement of low rates of responding. DRL is actually one of my favorite interventions. It is not something that's appropriate for everything. The goal of DRL is to decrease a behavior and not eliminate it. And because of that, you would never use this with dangerous behavior or a serious problem or something that just the student shouldn't be doing. For example, being physically aggressive to other students or something dangerous, self-injurious behavior. You never use it for that. But a lot of the issues that we deal with in schools are minor problems. And sometimes the behaviors themselves are not really even problems. It's just the fact that they happen at such a high rate, it creates a problem. For example, if you have a student with Asperger's syndrome who is constantly talking about some area of preferred interest, that is not a behavior you want to eliminate. It's appropriate for the student to discuss things that he or she is interested in. However, it's a problem if it happens at such a rate that it interferes with that student's learning or the learning of other students, or if it happens so much that it socially stigmatizes that student. Other kids don't want to be around him or her because they just can't handle the fact that he's always talking about World War I artillery shells. So with a DRL, what you do is you determine how many times the behavior is happening. Usually you'll begin with something called full session DRL. So this means I'm going to take a certain period of time. Let's say it's a history class that lasts 1 hour. And I'm going to establish a number of times that this behavior can occur within the history class and the student still earns a reinforcer if he or she has engaged in the behavior that many times or less during that period of time. So a reason I picked a history class, I was thinking of a kid that I worked with. He was fascinated with Nazi Germany. And so he would make comments or ask questions about Nazi Germany in history class, even when the class was talking about the Civil War. So it was a problem. The history teacher was open to him just doing that a lot less. He realized that it would be very hard for him just to not talk about Nazi Germany at all. And I think we actually would have had more behavior problems if we had tried to do that. So we took baseline data and we determined on average how many comments he would make during a 1 hour history class. And then we set up an initial reinforcement criteria so that if he did it that many times or less, he could earn a reinforcer at the end of the class. If you're working with very young children or students with more severe cognitive disabilities, whole session DRL might be too long of a period of time. For instance, a 1 hour class period or 1 hour period of time would be entirely too long for a 5-year-old child or a young student with severe disabilities. You can still use DRL in these situations, and I've done it many times. You take the session length and you divide it up into intervals. So let's say that the class period was about an hour, and we could divide that up into 5-minute segments. Then within each 5-minute segment, we can determine the average occurrence of a behavior. So if the behavior happens 20 times in an hour, that's going to be about once for every 5 minutes. So you'd need to create something visual for the student in this instance to show him or her that the behavior had happened. An example that I used with a student was he was nonverbal, and he would jump up out of his chair and scream, and he during independent work. And this happened a lot to the extent that the teacher was really just fed up with it and getting really annoyed with it. So I did a DRL with him, and I put pennies on with Velcro on an orange strip and put that on his desk. Every time he would jump up and scream, the teacher would just take one of the pennies off. If you reached the end of the interval and he still had a penny left, he could earn a reinforcer, and he actually was something to drink because he was, I think, screaming so much he was thirsty. But he would just exchange that penny for something to drink, and then he would get his penny card filled up again. And these were 15-minute intervals, and I think he could do it like 3 or 4 times within 15 minutes. As he continued to be successful, we did 2 things. We decreased the number of pennies he started out with, and we got those down to about 3, I think. And then we started increasing the length of the interval from 15 minutes to 20 minutes to 25 minutes to 30 minutes. You can do either of those. Usually you don't do them both at the same time. So you might start just increasing the interval slightly and leaving the DRL limit, is what it's called, the same. And then once you get to a certain interval size, you might start decreasing the number of times the behavior can occur. So this is the way you thin or fade schedule with DRL. Another way to use DRL is called spaced responding DRL. Here you require the student to go a certain period of time without engaging in a behavior before it gets reinforced. This might sound a lot like DRO because it sort of is. I've actually never used this because I think it would be quite cumbersome. You'd have to literally start a timer every time a behavior occurred, and if it was not long enough, then you just reset the timer. I either go with interval DRO or whole session DRO. Okay, DRL is very effective. At least I've always found it to work really well because you're not asking a lot of a student. And also the fact that these are behaviors that are not really dangerous. Sometimes they're not even inappropriate, they just happen too much. So it usually works really well. However, it is not fast because the behavior is going to occur a number of times and then it takes a while before the rate gets reduced. Change happens fairly slowly. So if it's something that has to be changed really quickly, it might not be the best intervention. I find that for behaviors for which it's appropriate, it works really well. However, it's not going to eliminate a behavior ever, and it's going to take a while to make the change occur. There's some situations in which full session DRL is appropriate, and some sessions in which spaced responding might work better, or interval responding. I find that full session usually works pretty well if you provide some kind of visual feedback to the student. And most of the time when I've used DRL, it's been with full session. So when you implement DRL, you begin with some baseline data. You calculate the inner response time or inner response interval. You set an initial DRL limit that is equal to or slightly lower than the baseline number of occurrences. For example, if the behavior happened an average of 15 times within a class period during baseline, I'm going to set my initial DRL limit at 15. Then, once the student is successful, you come up with a criteria for changing or thinning the schedule of reinforcement. When you thin a DRL schedule, it means the student has to engage in a behavior fewer and fewer times in order to still be reinforced. So I may go from 15 times to 12 times within a class period, to 10 times to 8 times, and then I might drop down to 5 times within a class period. The student in my example that made the comments about Nazi Germany, he would do that about 15 to 20 times in a class period, I believe. So we started out with around 18, I think, as his initial DRL, and he would self-monitor. We paired this with self-monitoring so that when he made a comment, he would cross it off. It's not one of the self-monitoring sheets I'm most proud of, but it was something that worked for him. It had swastikas on it, and he would cross out a swastika every time he made a Nazi Germany comment. Hey, it was what worked. So he wanted at least one of those left at the end of the class period. When we faded the schedule, we went down from 18 to 15 to 13 to 12, and I think it eventually got down to about 3 or 4. And then we replaced the swastikas with allied stars, and everybody was happier. I always like to pair DRL with self-monitoring whenever I can. So even with children with more significant cognitive delays, I've been able to use something manipulative or something they could move from one side of a folder to another. With other students, I'll use a self-monitoring sheet. Have them count up at the end of the session the number of times they engaged in a behavior, and then they can self-evaluate whether or not they met the criteria for reinforcement. So I would always like to have the kids take their sheets to the teacher and turn them in and either say, you know, I made it today, I earned the reinforcer, or no, I didn't today, but I'll try harder next time.